I texted my son, just got discharged from the hospital. Doctor said I can't walk yet. Can you pick me up when you have time? He replied, my wife said we can't keep dropping everything for you every time. Just call an Uber. When they found out who picked me up. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Martha Jean Coleman. For 40 years, my world was one of logistics. As the executive assistant to the founder and CEO of Sinclair Systems, I was not a secretary, I was a gatekeeper, a strategist and the operational core of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. My job was to anticipate needs, to solve logistical nightmares before they became problems, and to move heaven and earth with a quiet, unshakable competence. I managed crises that would break most people, and I did it with a calm efficiency that was the bedrock of my boss's empire. This is the story of a small, personal logistical nightmare, a problem I could not solve on my own. It's the story of how the complex, powerful systems I had managed my entire life were there for me in my moment of need, while the simple human system I had built my family on suffered a catastrophic and unforgivable failure. The discharge lounge of St. Michael's Hospital was a study in beige, a room designed for the specific purgatorial limbo between sickness and freedom. I sat in a standard-issue wheelchair, my left leg encased in a heavy fiberglass cast from my toes to just below my knee, a fractured tibia the result of a stupid simple fall on a patch of black ice a week ago. My handbag, a sturdy practical leather satchel that had been my work companion for 2 decades, sat in my lap. Inside it was a sheaf of discharge papers filled with instructions I couldn't possibly follow on my own, and a prescription for painkillers I couldn't get filled until I was home. I looked at my phone, the screen's bright, cheerful light a stark contrast to the sterile gloom of the room. I reread the text exchange for the 10th time, not because I couldn't believe it, but because the archivist in me needed to catalog the exact moment of the breach. It was a simple request, a logistical problem that required a 30-minute car ride. I was not asking for a favor, I was a mother in a wheelchair, unable to walk, asking her only son for help. The reply, which had arrived 5 minutes later, was not from my son. I knew that with a cold gut-level certainty. It was a forwarded message, a corporate communiqué from the new CEO of his life, his wife, Jenna. The words were his, but the sentiment, the cold, calculated cruelty of it, was entirely hers. My wife said we can't keep dropping everything for you every time. Just call an Uber. There it was, the final, documented proof of a system failure I had been observing for years. My wife said, the 3 words that had become the preamble to every excuse, every cancelled plan, every slow, methodical step back from his role as a son. He was no longer an independent entity. He was a subsidiary, a branch office of Jenna Coleman Incorporated. And the new corporate policy was one of ruthless, unapologetic downsizing of all familial obligations. We can't keep dropping everything for you every time, as if my needs were a constant, frivolous drain on their precious, high-powered lives. This was the first time in 3 years I had asked him for anything that required more than a 10-minute phone call. And finally, the insult that was meant to be a solution. Just call an Uber. The casual, dismissive toss-off of a problem he couldn't be bothered to solve himself. A stranger, a gig economy driver in a 10-year-old sedan, was to be entrusted with the task of getting his mother, a woman who could not walk, home from the hospital. It was not a suggestion, it was an abdication, a complete and total surrender of his role as my son. A hot, sharp flash of rage, a feeling I had not allowed myself to experience in years, was quickly, methodically suppressed. Rage was an inefficient emotion, it clouded judgment and led to poor decision-making. I had spent a lifetime in rooms with powerful, screaming men, and I had learned that the quietest person in the room is always the one with the real power. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. I would not engage in a messy, pointless text message war. I was a problem solver. In my 40 years at Sinclair Systems, my primary function was to ensure that the time and energy of one of the world's most brilliant and influential men, Mr. Julian Sinclair, was never ever wasted. I was the firewall between him and the rest of the world. I managed his schedule, a complex multi-dimensional jigsaw puzzle of board meetings, international travel and top-secret R&D briefings. I anticipated his needs before he was aware of them himself. I was the person who knew that he needed a specific type of mineral water in his hotel room in Tokyo, that he was allergic to the lilies his investors' wives were so fond of sending, that his estranged daughter's birthday was a day that required a mysteriously cleared schedule, and a quiet, uninterrupted afternoon. My loyalty to him was absolute, and his trust in me was the same. I had handled crises that would have been front-page news, burying them with a quiet, surgical discretion. I had arranged for a private jet to a specialized clinic in Switzerland for a key engineer who had suffered a sudden medical crisis, the entire operation executed in under 3 hours. I had negotiated the retrieval of a stolen prototype from a competitor, using a series of back channels and a level of psychological warfare that would have made an intelligence agent proud. I had been the silent, invisible architect of the smooth, efficient functioning of his empire, and in return he had given me his complete and total respect, and a level of compensation that had allowed me to buy my beautiful home outright and to raise my son in a world of comfort and opportunity. Now, sitting in this beige impersonal room, my own small personal logistical crisis laid bare. I thought of the man I had served for 4 decades. I had retired 6 months ago, a difficult emotional decision prompted by the same health concerns that had led to this fractured tibia. He had thrown me a retirement party that was the talk of the city, a lavish, heartfelt affair where he had, in a rare public display of emotion, called me not his assistant but his partner in the trenches. He had made me promise that if I ever needed anything at all, I would call him. I had of course assured him I would, knowing full well that I never would. I was Martha Jean Coleman. I was the solver of problems, not the source of them. But my son's text message had changed the equation. It had voided the social contract. My son and his wife had made a business decision, a cold hard calculation that my needs were an unacceptable drain on their resources. And so I would make a business decision of my own. I looked at the Uber app on my phone, its cheerful modern icon a symbol of my son's casual, cruel dismissal. I considered it for a moment, the thought of a stranger struggling to get me and my cast and my wheelchair into their car. A fresh hot wave of humiliation. No, I would not. I closed the app. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb moving past the names of friends and neighbors, people I knew would have dropped everything to come and get me. But I did not want their pity. I did not want to be a burden. I wanted a solution, a logistical correction. My thumb stopped on a name that was listed simply as JS. I had not called this number in 6 months. It was his private personal line, a number known to only a handful of people in the world. I took a deep, steadying breath, the quiet, competent professional in me, taking over, and I made the call. He answered on the second ring. "Martha Jun?" he asked, his voice a familiar authoritative baritone, laced with a note of genuine surprise and concern. "Is everything all right?" "Good afternoon, Mr. Sinclair," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as if I were briefing him on a quarterly earnings report. "I do apologize for calling you on your private line. I have a small, personal logistical situation that requires a solution, and I find myself temporarily short of assets." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and I knew he was processing the subtext of my words, the carefully chosen, professional language that was a hallmark of our 40-year partnership. "Tell me what you need, Martha Jean," he said, his voice now stripped of its surprise, replaced by the quiet, focused intensity of a commander assessing a battlefield. I laid out the facts with a dispassionate clarity. The fall, the fractured tibia, the doctor's orders, the discharge from the hospital, the wheelchair, and finally the transportation issue. I did not mention my son. I did not complain. I did not betray any emotion. I simply presented the problem, as I had done thousands of times before. "I require transportation from St. Michael's Hospital to my home," I concluded. "A vehicle that can accommodate a wheelchair and a passenger who is currently unable to talk would be ideal." He did not ask questions about my son. He was a man who could read between the lines better than anyone I had ever known. He knew that the very fact I was calling him meant that my primary asset, my own child, had failed me. The fury in his voice, when he spoke, was a quiet, controlled and terrifying thing. "Stay exactly where you are, Martha Jean," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Do not call an Uber. Do not call a taxi. I will handle this personally. My car will be there in 20 minutes. He hung up the phone. I sat in the sterile silence of the discharge lounge, my phone in my hand, and I felt a profound sense of relief. Exactly 19 minutes later, a vehicle pulled up to the hospital's discharge entrance. It was not a taxi, it was not an Uber, it was a 2024 Rolls-Royce Phantom, a magnificent, gleaming black behemoth of a car that seemed to suck all the light and sound from the surrounding street. Its presence was so profound, so utterly out of place in the mundane world of hospital pickups, that it brought the already slow traffic to a complete reverent standstill. A uniformed chauffeur emerged from the driver's side, a tall, imposing man with the quiet, professional demeanor of a Secret Service agent. He walked around the car and opened the rear passenger door with a silent, practiced grace. And from the plush, cream-colored leather interior a man emerged. It was Julian Sinclair. He was 72 years old, but he moved with the energy and the purpose of a man half his age. He was wearing a simple dark gray cashmere sweater and charcoal trousers, an outfit that probably cost more than my son's car, but he wore it with an air of complete unstudied indifference. He was no longer the CEO of a global tech empire. He was a private citizen, but his power, his authority, his immense palpable presence, had not retired with him. He strode into the discharge lounge, his eyes scanning the room until they found me. The worried, professional concern on his face was a balm to a wound I had not even allowed myself to acknowledge. "Martha Jean," he said, his voice a low, angry rumble that was meant for my ears alone. "What in God's name happened?" He knelt beside my wheelchair, his hand resting gently on my arm, his eyes taking in the cast, my pale, tired face, my situation, and in that moment, the professional facade I had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Just a little. The quiet, profound, and deeply human kindness in his eyes was more overwhelming than any of my son's cruelty. The ride home was a surreal and deeply comforting experience. Mr. Sinclair and his chauffeur, a man named Thomas who was as silent and as efficient as a ghost, handled the logistics of getting me and my wheelchair into the Rolls-Royce with a gentle, practiced ease. The car's interior was a world of its own, a silent leather and wood-lined sanctuary that smelled of old money and quiet power. As we pulled away from the hospital, gliding through the city streets with a silence that was almost unnerving, Mr. Sinclair began to ask quiet, pointed questions. He did not ask about my son directly. He was too clever, too discreet for that. He asked about my recovery plan. Who was going to be staying with me? Who had prepared my house for my return? Who was going to handle the cooking, the cleaning, the simple mundane tasks of daily life that were now for me impossible? To each of his questions I gave a simple, honest, and increasingly damning answer. No one, and no one. When we arrived at my beautiful two-storied brick home, the house I had worked my entire life to own, the true extent of my logistical problem became starkly, undeniably clear. Thomas, the chauffeur, helped me out of the car and into my wheelchair, but then we were faced with the 5 concrete steps that led from the sidewalk to my front porch. An impassable mountain range. Without a word, Mr. Sinclair, a 72-year-old billionaire, simply bent down, and with a strength that was as surprising as it was gentle, he lifted me from the wheelchair and carried me up the stairs and into my own home. He placed me carefully on the living room sofa, his expression a mask of grim, controlled fury. He then went back outside, retrieved my wheelchair, my handbag and my discharge papers and brought them inside. And then his sharp executive eye began to assess the situation. He walked through the ground floor of my house, his movements quiet, deliberate and analytical. He was not seeing my home, he was seeing a series of logistical failures. He opened the refrigerator and saw its sparse contents, a half-empty carton of milk, a few eggs, a wilting head of lettuce. He looked at the pantry and saw he looked at the steep, unforgiving staircase that led up to my bedroom and my bathroom, a staircase that was for me, as insurmountable as Mount Everest. He saw in stark, undeniable detail the complete and total lack of any preparation for my return, for my recovery. He saw the evidence of a profound and a deeply personal neglect. He returned to the living room, his face a mask of stone. He looked at me, his eyes full of a quiet, protective rage that was more comforting than any words of sympathy could ever be. "This is unacceptable, Martha Jean," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "This is a systemic failure of the highest order. And we," he said, the word a quiet, powerful declaration of a renewed partnership, "are going to correct it." Immediately, without another word to me, Mr. Sinclair stepped into my kitchen. He took out his phone and he went to work. The man who had once commanded a global empire from a futuristic top-floor corner office was now running a new and far more personal operation from my humble, slightly dated kitchen. He was a general marshalling his forces, and his voice on the phone was the quiet, calm, and utterly terrifying sound of a man who was not used to being told no. The first call was to his personal physician, one of the top orthopedic specialists in the country. He described my injury, my discharge, and my situation with a clipped, precise, and medically accurate terminology that was as impressive as it was surprising. A house call was arranged for that evening. The second call was to the CEO of a high-end private nursing service, a company that Sinclair Systems used for its own top executives. He did not request a caregiver. He demanded one. He described the level of care I would require, the hours they would work, and the exact time he expected the first nurse to arrive at my door. He concluded the call with a quiet, chilling sentence. The cost is irrelevant. The quality of care is not. Do you understand? The third call was to a name I recognized, the owner of a construction and home modification company that specialized in accessibility solutions. David, it's Julian Sinclair, he began, his voice leaving no room for pleasantries. I have an emergency installation. I need a residential stairlift. The best one you have, installed today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. There was a pause, and I could faintly hear the sound of the man on the other end of the line protesting, talking about schedules and backlogs. Mr. Sinclair cut him off. Your company has 2 very lucrative contracts with my foundation, he said, his voice as cold and as hard as Hall-est steel. Those contracts are up for renewal next month. I need a stairlift installed today. Are we clear? The silence on the other end was, I imagined, profound. The final call was to the owner of a gourmet organic meal delivery service, the kind that catered to the city's wealthiest and most health-conscious residents. He arranged for a full consultation with a nutritionist, and a delivery schedule that would keep my refrigerator and pantry stocked with healthy, easy-to-prepare meals for the foreseeable future. Within the space of 15 minutes, my quiet, empty house had been transformed into a command center of competent, high-end care. The systemic failure was being corrected, not with the hesitant, grudging inefficiency of my own family, but with the swift, overwhelming, and terrifyingly efficient application of immense personal power and unlimited financial resources. Julian Sinclair was not just solving my problem. He was building a new and infinitely superior system around me, a fortress of care designed to protect me from the consequences of my own son's neglect. While my home was being transformed into a state-of-the-art recovery suite, my son Robert and his wife Jenna were undoubtedly enjoying a quiet, self-satisfied afternoon at their own home. They had successfully established a boundary. They had politely but firmly declined my unreasonable request and had empowered me to solve my own problems by suggesting the modern efficient solution of an Uber. They would have seen their actions not as cruel but as a necessary act of self-care, a healthy recalibration of a dysfunctional family dynamic. They would have felt a profound sense of relief, the quiet, smug satisfaction of a difficult task completed. Their peaceful, self-congratulatory afternoon was interrupted by a sharp, authoritative knock on their front door. Robert, I imagine, would have opened it to find a woman standing on his doorstep. She would have been in her early 30s, impeccably dressed in a sharp, stylish business suit, her expression a mask of cool, professional neutrality. She was, though they did not know it, Mr. Sinclair's new executive assistant, a woman who was, in every way, my hand-picked successor. She would have been the very picture of the world of quiet, corporate power that Jenna so desperately aspired to be a part of. The woman would have smiled, a brief, professional flash of her teeth that did not reach her eyes. Mr. Robert Coleman? She would have asked, her voice polite but firm. Robert, undoubtedly confused, would have nodded. My name is Isabel Vance, she would have said. I am the executive assistant to Mr. Julian Sinclair. Mr. Sinclair is currently with your mother, Mrs. Martha Jean Coleman, at her residence. He has asked that you and your wife join them there as soon as possible, to coordinate a schedule for her ongoing care. The statement would have landed with the force of a physical blow. The name Julian Sinclair was not just a name in our city, it was a legend. He was the reclusive visionary billionaire who had built the city's largest and most successful company. He was a figure of almost mythical power and influence, a man who did not move in their world, or any world that was accessible to them. The idea that this man, this legend, was currently in my living room, was a concept so bizarre, so utterly outside the bounds of their reality, that it would have been impossible to process. Their confusion would have quickly given way to a new and far more terrifying emotion, a dawning, sickening sense of dread. Why was Julian Sinclair at my house, and why was he summoning them through his official corporate emissary, as if they were junior employees being called to a disciplinary hearing? The drive to my house, a journey they had so recently refused to make, would have been a silent, nerve-wracking affair. When they arrived, the quiet residential street outside my home would have been almost unrecognizable. A large, unmarked white van from the home modification company was parked at the curb, its side doors open to reveal a team of uniformed technicians unloading the components of a very expensive stairlift. A sleek black sedan from the private nursing service was parked behind it, and in my driveway, a space usually occupied by my modest 10-year-old sedan, sat the gleaming black and utterly unmistakable form of Julian Sinclair's Rolls-Royce Phantom. The sight of that car, that monument to a level of wealth and power so profound it was almost obscene, would have been the moment they truly understood that the world as they knew it had just been irrevocably, and terrifyingly, altered. They walked into my house, their faces masks of pale, apprehensive confusion, and they found it transformed. The quiet, familiar home of their mother was now a bustling, efficient command center. The technicians from the construction company were taking measurements on the main staircase. A woman in crisp blue nursing scrubs was in the kitchen, organizing a delivery of high-end organic groceries. Another woman, a physical therapist with a briefcase and a clipboard, was quietly consulting with the nurse. The air was filled with the quiet, competent hum of expensive professional people doing their jobs. And in the center of it all, in the living room, they found me. I was sitting on my sofa, my casting-cased leg propped up on a plush ottoman that had not been there that morning. I was calmly sipping a cup of herbal tea, and sitting in the armchair opposite me, looking as comfortable and as commanding as if he were in his own corner office, was the legendary Julian Sinclair. He looked up as they entered, his expression a mask of cool Arctic disappointment. The power dynamic of their world, the one in which they were the busy, important adults, and I was the needy, inconvenient mother, had not just been shifted, it had been utterly, comprehensively and permanently annihilated. The scene that unfolded in my living room was a masterpiece of quiet corporate-style psychological warfare. Robert was the first to break. He was a sales manager, a man who understood, on a primal level, the importance of hierarchies and the deference that was owed to power, and he was now standing in the presence of the most powerful man he had ever met. He was starstruck, terrified, and completely, utterly speechless. He looked at me, at Miss Sinclair, at the chaos of competent care that had descended upon my home, and his face was a pale, sweating mask of confusion. Jenna, however, was a different animal. She was a player, a woman who had built her career in the cutthroat world of corporate real estate. Her first instinct was not to crumble but to control the narrative. She saw the new terrifying power dynamic in the room, and she immediately tried to reposition herself on the winning side. She rushed to my side, her face a mask of beautifully crafted and utterly fraudulent concern. "Oh, Martha Jin," she gushed, her voice a symphony of false sympathy. "You should have told us. We had no idea it was this serious. We would have been here in a second. We were just so worried about you." It was a brilliant, shameless performance. She was attempting to rewrite history, to erase the casual, cruel dismissal of her text message, and replace it with a story of a loving, concerned but tragically misinformed daughter-in-law. Julian Sinclair let her finish. He watched her performance with the cool, detached interest of a biologist observing a particularly unattractive species of insect. When she was done, he did not raise his voice. He did not get angry. He simply, and with a quiet, devastating precision, cut her off at the knees. He turned his cool, analytical gaze to her, his eyes as cold and as hard as polished steel. "You had no idea?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "That is not the information I have." He reached into the pocket of his cashmere sweater and pulled out his own phone. With a few deft movements of his thumb, he brought up a screen. He didn't show it to her. He didn't need to. "I have it on good authority," he continued, his voice the quiet, calm sound of a judge delivering a verdict, "that you were in fact fully aware of Mrs. Coleman's situation. I believe your exact suggestion to your husband was for her to—" he paused, as if to recall the precise wording, "call an Uber." The word Uber hung in the air. A small, ugly and utterly damning piece of evidence. He had seen the text. I had not shown it to him, but I knew with an absolute certainty that he had his ways. He had an entire global security division at his disposal. Getting a copy of a single text message would have been a trivial matter for him. He looked from Jenna's now crumbling face to Robert's pale, terrified one. "I trust," he concluded, his voice a masterpiece of quiet, chilling understatement, "that my chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce was a suitable substitute." The quiet, brutal finality of his question was a checkmate. There was no response. There was no escape. They had been caught. Not just in a lie, but in a profound and a deeply ugly failure of basic human decency. And they had been caught by a man who had the power to make them pay for it. The silence in the room stretched thick and heavy. Robert and Jenna just stood there, two statues in a museum of their own failure. Mr. Sinclair then continued, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were laying out the terms of a new business venture. "It has become clear to me," he said, his gaze sweeping over them with a quiet, dismissive contempt, "that Mrs. Coleman's own family is far too busy, far too important to be burdened with the logistics of her care. Therefore I have taken the liberty of handling it myself. Consider it a long overdue adjustment to her retirement benefits package." He then, with a terrifying, dispassionate clarity, laid out the terms of that package. "As of today," he explained, "a new trust has been established in Mrs. Coleman's name. This trust will be funded by a personal and a very generous contribution from me. It will cover the full and ongoing costs of her care. This includes but is not limited to full-time in-home nursing, a dedicated physical therapist, a personal driver and vehicle for all her transportation needs, and any and all home modifications required to ensure her comfort and safety. Think of it," he added, a small cold smile touching his lips, "as deferred compensation for 40 years of unparalleled service and unwavering loyalty." Every word was a hammer blow, a quiet, systematic dismantling of their last pathetic shreds of self-respect. He was not just providing for me, he was doing so in a way that highlighted their own catastrophic failure. He was demonstrating with the overwhelming force of his own wealth and competence exactly what a son and daughter-in-law should have done. But he wasn't finished. The true and most devastating part of his counteroffensive was yet to come. He turned his attention from the now crumbling Jenna to her pale, silent and utterly terrified husband. He looked at my son Robert, not with the anger he had shown Jenna, but with a look of cold, analytical disappointment, the look of a CEO assessing a deeply flawed and underperforming asset. "Robert," he said, his voice now a quiet, almost conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than any shouting could ever be. "You are a sales manager at Northwood Industries, are you not?" Robert, startled that this man would know or care about his own relatively insignificant career, could only manage a small, jerky nod. "I thought so," Mr. Sinclair said. "I sit on the board of the parent company that acquired Northwood last year. A fascinating company. We have high hopes for its future." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle into the room. He was not just a legend, he was, in a very real and a very direct way, my son's boss's boss's boss. "It has always been my belief," he continued, his eyes locked on Robert's, "that the character of a man in his personal life is a direct indicator of his character in his professional life. Loyalty, integrity, the ability to anticipate needs and to act decisively in a crisis. These are the qualities I value above all others. They are the qualities that your mother, Martha Jean, embodied for 40 years. They are the foundation upon which my entire company was built." He let another heavy silence hang in the air before he delivered the final fatal blow. "It has come to my attention," he said, his voice a masterpiece of quiet corporate menace, "that you may be lacking in some of those core competencies. A sales manager who shows such a stunning lack of loyalty, such a profound failure to manage a simple personal crisis, raises certain red flags. It gives me deep concern about your judgment and your future with our organization. I will, of course," he concluded, his voice a soft, chilling promise, "be sharing my concerns with the other members of the board at our next quarterly meeting." It was not a threat of being fired. It was something far more subtle, and far more terrifying. It was the quiet, polite, and absolutely devastating promise of a career that was, as of that moment, officially and permanently over. The quiet corporate menace of Mr. Sinclair's words was the final, devastating blow. The thin, fragile veneer of my son and daughter-in-law's composure shattered completely, and the raw, ugly panic that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted in a geyser of humiliating desperation. Robert was the first to break. The terrifying existential threat to his career, the only thing that gave him a sense of status and self-worth, was a far more powerful motivator than any sense of familial duty. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of pathetic, pleading supplication. "Mr. Sinclair, sir," he stammered, his voice a strangled, desperate squeak. "Please, it was a misunderstanding, a terrible, terrible mistake. I love my mother. I would do anything for her." Jenna, seeing her husband's pathetic display, and realizing that her own carefully constructed world was about to be dragged down with his, immediately joined the chorus of desperate, self-serving remorse. The cool, ambitious real estate professional was gone, replaced by a sobbing, hysterical woman who was literally begging for her financial life. "He's right," she wailed, tears that were, I am certain, entirely genuine in their terror streaming down her face. "We were wrong. We were so wrong. Please, Mr. Sinclair, don't do this. We'll take care of her, we'll do everything. We'll move in, we'll hire the nurses, we'll pay for everything. Just give us a chance to make it right. It was a grotesque and a deeply satisfying spectacle. The two people who just that morning had not been willing to give me a 30-minute car ride were now offering to dedicate their entire lives to my care. Their sudden miraculous conversion was not born of love. Of course, it was born of the cold, hard, and deeply motivating terror of a powerful man. They were not speaking to me. They were pleading with him. They knew with a final humiliating certainty where the real power in the room now lay. They had through their own actions rendered themselves completely and utterly irrelevant to the management of my life. Julian Sinclair listened to their frantic, desperate backpedaling with an air of profound and weary disgust. He did not deign to reply. He simply turned his gaze to me, a silent, respectful question in his eyes. He was giving me the floor. He was giving me the final word. He had built the guillotine. It was now up to me to decide whether or not to let the blade fall. I looked at my son, at his tear-streaked, terrified face. I looked at my daughter-in-law, at her crumbling mask of ambition and greed. I saw them in that moment for exactly what they were, two weak, frightened, and deeply selfish people who had made a catastrophic mistake. I felt a flicker of something, a ghost of the maternal love I had once felt for the boy my son had been. But it was a faint, distant thing, an echo from a life that was already over. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. And then I spoke. My voice was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was simply and quietly tired. That won't be necessary, I said. My words a soft, final, and utterly devastating dismissal. Mr. Sinclair has the logistics handled. My quiet, simple statement. The calm finality of it was more cutting than any shouting, any recrimination could ever have been. It was a formal notification that their services as my family were no longer required. I had outsourced the job of my son and daughter-in-law to a more competent and a more reliable contractor. I had, in the cold, efficient language of the world I came from, made them redundant. The aftermath was a study in the quiet, invisible power of a man like Julian Sinclair. The world of my son and daughter-in-law did not end with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating whimper. Robert was not fired from his job. That would have been too crude, too obvious a move for a man like Mr. Sinclair. Instead, a far more subtle, and a far more cruel fate befell him. He was simply sidelined. He was passed over for a promotion he had been expecting. His biggest accounts were quietly reassigned to a younger, more promising sales manager. He was left with a portfolio of small, dead-end clients, a career purgatory from which there would be no escape. He was not unemployed. He was, in a far more profound and a far more humiliating way, irrelevant. His career trajectory, once a source of pride and ambition, had been permanently and irrevocably stalled. Jenna, too, found that the world had suddenly become a colder, more difficult place. She operated in a world of connections, of insider information, of lucrative real estate deals that were made on the golf course and over expensive lunches, and she found, with a growing, sickening sense of dread, that the doors to that world were suddenly and inexplicably closing to her. The big clients she had been courting were no longer returning her calls. The exclusive listings she had been hoping to secure were being given to other, less experienced agents. The Sinclair name and the quiet, far-reaching influence of the man who bore it cast a very long and a very cold shadow. They were not ruined, not in a dramatic, public way. They were simply and quietly being squeezed. The opportunities and the oxygen slowly being bled from their professional lives. Facing a future of financial stagnation and social irrelevance, they made one last, desperate attempt to appeal to me. Not for forgiveness but for a loan. They appeared at my door a week later, their faces masks of forced, desperate humility. They were stopped on the front porch by my new, full-time caregiver, a formidable, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who had been handpicked by Mr. Sinclair's own private nursing service. They tried to push past her, their voices a mixture of pleading and a faint, lingering echo of their old entitlement. Sarah, who had clearly been well briefed on the situation, did not budge. She stood in the doorway, a calm, immovable object, and she delivered the message I had instructed her to give. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice polite but firm, "but Mrs. Coleman is in a meeting and cannot be disturbed." They stood on my porch for a long, silent moment, the finality of their new reality finally truly sinking in. They were not just being kept out of my house, they were being kept out of my life. The gatekeeper, the role I had once so proudly held for Mr. Sinclair, had now been turned upon them. The firewall was up, and they were permanently on the outside. The final scene of my old life, and the first scene of my new one took place 6 months later. My fractured tibia had healed completely. I was walking again with the aid of a simple, elegant cane, but my stride was strong, my purpose clear. He had not asked me to come back to work for him. He had asked me to become his partner. He had poured a significant portion of his own personal fortune into establishing a new, multi-million-dollar charitable organization, the Sinclair Coleman Foundation for Educational Equity, and he had, after a long and a very persuasive series of conversations, convinced me to come out of retirement, not as an assistant, but as its first executive director. I was in my new office, a beautiful, light-filled space with a panoramic view of the city, fielding a call from the dean of a local university. We were discussing the terms of a new scholarship program for underprivileged students, a project that had become my new passion. My new assistant, a bright, fiercely competent young woman, who reminded me a little of myself, 30 years ago, entered the room and placed a single thick envelope on my desk. I finished my call, my mind buzzing with the quiet, satisfying energy of meaningful work. I picked up the envelope. It was from my son. Inside was a long, multi-page letter. It was a formal and a deeply pathetic apology. It was filled with excuses, with self-serving explanations, with a detailed and a deeply unconvincing account of the pressures and the stresses that had led to their terrible mistake. It was the desperate final plea of a man who had lost everything and who was finally, belatedly, trying to undo the damage. I read the first page, and then I stopped. The words were meaningless to me. They were a document from a closed archive, a historical artifact from a life that was no longer mine. I placed the letter back in its envelope. I did not tear it up. That would have been an emotional act.